Hey everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with Dr. Mark Word. We're going to be talking about whether we can trust scholars. We're going to be talking about how translations are made. How are you doing today, Dr. Ward?
Doing great, staying really busy, but glad to have a few minutes to chat about all this interesting stuff.
Awesome. That's so great. Okay, so can you give the audience a little bit about your background on the topic of translations, just education, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were saved as young adults and before they met one another, and therefore, of course, before they had me. So I had the privilege of a faithful Christian upbringing, but my parents were processing, the different theological strands that are out there. And for a while, we were in a King James only church. I went to their Christian school during high school. I had a good experience. I am glad for that. I'm grateful. No bitterness, zero bitterness. But I did come over time to reject that one portion of their teaching, that is the King James onlyism, and that really is probably the main source of my interest in Bible translation. Boy, it's hard to say because I also just love the Bible and I love the Lord and I want to follow what Scripture says, and so I always had an interest in knowing what the Bible says. So I can actually trace that back to those years as well. In a positive way, that one of the great strengths of that King James only church was that they took the Bible with total seriousness and expected people, even teenagers like me, to read it and work to understand it and to trust it. And so I've held on to the most important things I was taught there and just had to refine that one element. And so then I was actually a graphic design major, went to Christian college, went to Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina. And little did I know that I had crossed something of a Rubicon. I had gone from King James only circles to non-King James only circles. I didn't really know that, but I landed in a church that happened to be also at the time just about to be kind of swept up into that controversy. And my pastor had a PhD in New Testament, and he was an amazing expositor. I loved his expository sermons in Ephesians, grew so much, and he was able to teach me through issues of the Bible's text and translation at the same time that he was called upon, for reasons I won't get into, to have to engage in a public discussion about it. And through his influence, really, I was called to ministry, to Bible teaching ministry, and I elected, without even really thinking about it, to basically just, not thinking about it this way, to follow the same path he went down. I did end up doing what I don't recommend to everybody else, that is getting all my degrees from one place. I got a BA, MA, and PhD in Bible and theology related fields, BA in Bible, MA in Bible, and PhD in New Testament, all at Bob Jones. Finished that a little over 10 years ago, and worked for BJU Press after that. Got married somewhere in there to my wife. We have now 3 children. I was a Bible textbook author, and then about 7 or 8 years ago, I got a call from Faith Life, makers of Logos Bible software, asking if I'd be willing to take a job with them, and now I've been with them for all that time and really enjoyed doing all kinds of things. Academic editor at Lexham Press for a while. That was fun. Worked on the Lexham Survey of Theology, Lexham Context Commentary, and other projects like Piercing Heaven Prayers of the Puritans. I've been a writer for them, all kinds of things. I've been a presenter for them. I wrote a Lexham Press book that got turned into a documentary. That just Faith Life and / Logos has just been a fantastic place for me. And now I am a senior editor for digital content at the Word by Word blog, which is the official Logos blog. And my personal YouTube channel, I'll try to wrap it up with this, probably too long of an answer. My personal YouTube channel focuses a lot on Bible translation. I have a heart for the King James only crowd, and also for a lot of Bible reading Christians who are understandably, I think, confused. Why do we have so many Bible translations? Why do they differ? How can I know when the difference is due to this thing I've heard called New Testament textual criticism, and when is it due to this thing I've heard about, called translation philosophy? I find that there are a lot of Bible nerds out there who, because they haven't had the opportunity to study Greek and Hebrew, enjoy getting a little insight into those things, and so I address those topics on my personal YouTube channel.
That's awesome. There's a lot of stuff. I had never heard all that
And I
before.
can
So it's pretty
I can
cool.
throw a frisbee really far with commendable accuracy also, just FYI.
Okay, question. So in your YouTube videos, you got these like, these jokes, throwing a frisbee. So it's off the cuff, or is that in your script?
Oh, well, sometimes I am coy about this, but most often I just say it's pretty much all scripted. I probably 98% of my videos are scripted, and just a few I do off the cuff. I don't like to waste people's time. I think that comes from my main mentor, actually. I just felt like the whole time we were listening to sermons from this pastor, he was feeding us good Bible, and he instilled in me a desire to represent, to herald accurately what God's word says, and to come well prepared into any pulpit I happen to inhabit. And right now, YouTube is my pulpit, so I take that lesson from him.
Amen. Preach it, sir. Okay, so can you give us your general overview, your opinion on Bible translations, and I mean, do you have a favorite Bible translation?
Well, I wrote an article for the Logos blog a number of years ago that's been one of our most viewed out there. And it's not because the article is so great, though I sure hope it has truth in it. It's just because it's a question everybody's asking. The title was, Which Bible Translation is Best? And I answer it in the title, Which Bible Translation is Best? All the good ones. And I turned that into one of the chapters of my book, Authorized the Use and Misuse of the King James Bible, which is now, 5 years old. It just seems impossible. It's been quite a ride with that book. I've really, really enjoyed the fallout really from that book. I get messages from people all the time who've benefited from it, who were confused previously, and it really did begin to appear to me that one of the big problems that's driving all of the angst and even the fighting among Christians over Bible translation, and I don't just mean King James onlyists. I mean, I think there's a lot of fighting out there. It's driven by a subtle idea I think a lot of people don't realize they have, that there must be one best Bible translation out there, one truly accurate one, and I've got to be on a mission to find that one. And of course, the King James onlyists think they found it, but a whole lot of defenders of Bibles I like just fine. I love the ESV. I think there's a feeling of that out there, and maybe even more so at the NASB, and now with the Legacy Standard Bible, which all my exposure to it says it's good quality, done by responsible people. But people champion their favorite Bible translation in a way that violates what I came to see is really a theological implication of an implication of the theology of bibliology that evangelicals accept, and that is stated in the King James preface that no translation is inspired, and if they're not created by God, they're created by fallen and finite human beings like you and me, then I dare not expect them to be perfect, and I might as well expect instead to see value in multiple different Bible translations. So when I look at the whole spectrum, I see a huge problem out there of people thinking I've got to find the best one, assuming there is a best one, and then at least implicitly, if not explicitly, I saw it today on Twitter, condemning other people's translations. But these are people who don't have an understanding of the way translation really works, how difficult it is to get every bit of meaning across from original languages or any language into another, and therefore how valuable it is to have multiple English Bible translations. And I'll wrap up with this, that one of my most important biblical counseling teachers taught a replacement principle, that you can't just put off the old man, you got to put on the new. And if you replace something bad, if you take away something bad, you got to replace it with something good. And if I'm going to replace anything onlyism, King James onlyism, ESV onlyism, whatever, it's got to, I think the good thing to replace it is the learning the value of checking multiple good evangelical English Bible translations. And I think that's been a brand new thing, even to a lot of pastors that I've talked to. They didn't realize, boy, I should make this part of my regular Bible study. And that's where I'm aiming with a lot of my work.
That's awesome. Okay, so why do we keep getting new translations? It seems like it might be for the money. What do you think about that?
It's funny. Just like minutes ago, I got a call from somebody. I can't give his name. He probably wouldn't mind, but I didn't check with him in advance, and I don't want to reveal anything private. But he has privately funded multiple English Bible translations. None of them has been, super prominent. One of them, I'll just tantalize people with this, has been mildly, well known. And I actually saw the emails that he sent out to the biblical scholars who did this work, and I saw the money he offered them, and I just know this guy is not making money off this project. He's certainly not making back the investment that he put into it. I do not know all the details, I confess, but this is a guy whose heart is in getting God's word out to the church. That means, though, there is a mixture of answers, because without being a cynic, and while still being grateful for the good translations we have, I do think we have too many. I think it is, empirically speaking, confusing to a lot of Christian people, and certainly to a lot of non-Christian people, those who are paying attention. Most aren't, that we have so many. I do think money plays an undue role in the creation and maintenance of the system that we have now. But then I say, you know what? Under what system ever were Bible translations produced, without fallen and finite humans involved, right? So even if a given Bible translation was produced with the undue influence of money, how does that affect me? I can still benefit from it, because here's what I see. Zondervan, which is owned by HarperCollins, one of the biggest, I guess the biggest, publishing conglomerate in the U.S., they have wisely insulated the Committee for Bible Translation that's responsible for the NIV from those financial concerns. And that committee, led by Doug Moo, who's one of our top Romans commentators, our top one really in evangelicalism, they do their work without having to worry about sales. So everybody who's actually involved in sitting down and, quote unquote, putting pen to paper, they are sincere Bible scholars, sincere believers in Christ, in the gospel, who are just doing their best to get the Bible out to the church. As far as all the major modern evangelical English Bible translations that I'm familiar with, the ones that I'm talking about and promoting all the time. So I can say that, yeah, I'm not totally happy with the role that money plays, while also feeling like there are these countervailing factors. When I've actually known people involved, and I have now, I'm in Christian publishing, and I've had lots of conversations. These are all sincere people. Are they fallen and finite? Yes. But are they saved? Are they working for the good of the church? I would say yes. I can give sin its due, while also giving grace its due, giving God his due, and saying that he's done very good for us in giving us many good evangelical English Bible translations.
Amen. Yeah. So this is off the cuff. How much would you say is the most you've heard that someone got paid for a translation?
Oh, well, the only very specific information that I have, I'll give two, was I saw a given biblical scholar with a big name offered $5,000 to be a consultant on a given Bible translation that was not massively prominent, and indeed may never actually come to publication, except possibly privately. I can't give more details than that without getting permission. I probably would if I asked. I was just talking to the progenitor of this project mere minutes ago. And then I did talk to Vern Poythress of the ESV committee, and I have a great deal of respect for Vern. Actually, I don't quite see eye to eye with him on one major translation issue that he's written about, but I run his website, and I know him to be a godly, humble, meek, massively intelligent man. His wife is also extremely gifted and a very sweet Christian lady. I got to meet her once. I have a lot of interaction with Vern because I happen to run his website for various historical reasons. And one time I did ask him, like, okay, Dr. Poythress, did you get wealthy off of, working for the ESV committee? And he just laughed, and, the answer is no. And he told me at that time, a couple of years ago, I think, he was like driving a 2008 Honda Odyssey, I don't know, and living in the same home that he and his wife bought when they were newly married, near Westminster in Pennsylvania. So those are the two data points that I have. That's the role that I've seen. I have seen a little bit more internally at Lexham Press, but nobody here is making buku bucks on, say, our Lexham English Septuagint. That was a bit of a labor of love. And what I did see was that it takes a lot of very gifted highly educated people to do this kind of work well. I'm not saying, Tyndall did it by himself practically. I'm not saying that's impossible, but typically nowadays with the committee-based translations that we do, even when they're just for academic purposes like the Lexham English Septuagint, it took a lot of resources. So even if you hear numbers in the millions rolling around, think about all of the different people involved in the process, from translators to editors to compositors. To composite a Bible well, and people tolerate zero typos in Bibles. It's very expensive and difficult. So it does take money to do this well, and I'm glad that the Lord has given those kind of resources to his church.
Yeah, it's awesome. Okay, so why would you say there are reasons to, produce a new translation? So obviously you have, I mean, I don't know, maybe like political or money reasons, but could you talk about those if there are any, and just if there are any reasons like that people actually think like, we're learning more or something like that?
Yeah, I will limit my comments to the major modern evangelical English translations. Those are the ones that I'm familiar with. I support missionaries involved in Bible translation just personally. And so I know a little bit about those projects, but I think you're mainly asking about English. So I would say that for the major modern evangelical English Bible translations, the undue role that money plays has to be given its spot in the story. And yes, it is true that, for example, the CSB, and it's kind of widely known that the Southern Baptist Convention didn't want to have to keep paying royalties for all their Sunday school curriculum. If they used the NIV, they had to do that. But then, when you actually sit down to do the work, somebody like a Tom Schreiner, who's one of the leaders and progenitors of the CSB, which got a major refresh over the HCSB back in 2017, I believe it was. He's a very serious evangelical biblical scholar. I've interviewed him, and he's a gracious and meek and extremely gifted, talented guy. When he puts together a crew to do this kind of work, I think they are looking to fill a slot on that, left to right. We're not talking liberal to conservative here, but formal to functional spectrum that your viewers have probably seen. I'm sure you've seen, and although before the CSB came out, I would have said, we don't need any more. Somehow the CSB managed to hit a spot that seems a little more literal than the NIV, and noticeably less literal than the ESV and the NASB. It proved to be at a usefully different place on that timeline, and or not timeline, that spectrum. So I would say that all the major modern evangelical English Bible translations, kind of whether they did this on purpose or not, and I do think that it was largely on purpose, end up picking usefully different spots on that spectrum. It is useful, it's helpful to me as a Bible reader and me as a Bible teacher to know that the NIV is somewhat more interpretive. Probably I would call it centrist. Of course, the New Living Translation, which I'm just finishing up listening to the New Testament, the New Living Translation in my daily Bible time for myself. It is even more interpretive, more colloquial, less formal is the formal term, more dynamic, some people say. That's good, that's useful, that's helpful. That's the main thing I see when I'm asked to explain why do we need all these. I think it's good to have more formal and more functional or dynamic translations. I do think that there are niche academic and study translations that can come out, or niche ministry translations. I mean, we're so wealthy in so many ways in the English-speaking West that we can have a Bible translation that was made for children and prisoners. People who can't read so well. Obviously, plenty of prisoners can read just fine, but in general, what people ministering in those contexts, and I've done a little of that myself, actually a fair bit of it in that kind of world. What we found, I used the New International Reader's Version to great profit in a ministry to functionally illiterate adults. That Bible is also used for children. So we can afford to make these niche translations too. Those are just some of the things that I think some of the main things that people are thinking of when Christian publishers work to put out a Bible translation.
Yeah, so if I were to answer that question, I want to get your thoughts on this. So I would say that two reasons would be like, and so just to be clear, my main study is Old Testament, so this is where most of my thoughts, can go through. But I know, like in Genesis, like the writers like to make a lot of word plays. So if one word is also used in the second part of the book, it a lot of times in translations they won't be using the same word, and a lot of the reasons why they might change a translation is so that they can match, because they think that the writer of Genesis is trying to make a word play or add some type of emphasis. And a second reason I might think of would be like we know a lot more about languages, ancient cognates, which is like cousins
Right.
or whatever of Hebrew. So we essentially can learn more about the language, how it's used in other cultures. Uh, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's all true. I was answering your question on more of a macro level, and I forgot that you asked that also excellent micro level question. What about advances in biblical studies? I would say that's a micro level question because we're talking about often very obscure things. The reason that we don't know a given Hebrew word is that it's occurring in a context like, I did a video on Job 17:6, and Job says to his friends, I have become as a tabret, I think the King James says. And I'm thinking, okay, in what way is Job like a tambourine? But the contemporary translations say, no, it's he is saying that he is like one upon whom men spit. And if you look into it, it's because the cognate translations, all the way from Arabic ones to there are, not, I'm sorry, not cognate translations, cognate languages. And I'm getting a bunch of notifications buzzing in my ear. I have to close down my Slack app. That will be much better. Now I can focus. Those cognate languages, even one of them an Ethiopian language I had just learned about actually, their comparable word means spit. So that's a really minor thing. It's not worth doing a whole new Bible translation over that. And presumably, all of the major modern evangelical English Bible translations, given sufficient time after the right article comes out, explaining that, or the right dictionary, entry, updates our knowledge on that, they will all update that. That's not really a reason to make a new translation, but all of the translations that are in existence are going to do their best to stay abreast of those very kinds of things. The principle you talk about, it's called the principle of concordance. Using the same English word to translate a given Hebrew or Greek word. That too is useful, but not morally obligatory. The King James translators themselves said, we're not tied to a uniformity of wording. Like every time we see this Hebrew word, we have to say journeys and not travels. That's one of their examples. They said, I used to have this memorized. They had a wry little statement about people who, are tied to it like that. But you gave the reason for doing it, and that is that there are these literary devices that are at play that you want to expose to people. But every time you do that, you are having to compromise by giving up something else. That's just the way translation is. Robert Alter talks about this, and he's our master at translating literary devices from the Hebrew into the English. You just can't always get it across, which is another reason to use multiple English Bible translations, so you can see that same literary device or whatever element is in the language from multiple angles.
Funny you mentioned Robert Alter. Yeah, my audience hears about him a lot. I've done a lot of videos on the Genesis 1:1 when God began to create the heavens and the earth translation. Uh, but no, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm not an expert in this in any way. So when I asked you a specific question, I do not know the nuance that should. I don't even know how to ask half these questions, to be honest. But I appreciate your answer there. So how would you say that translations should be, or how are they usually started? I mean, is it, I guess maybe independent or the smaller translations, maybe some guy just wants to pay a bunch of scholars and that's just where it starts. Can you give us general info on how these translations typically get started?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends, but the major ones out there, probably the best way to get a handle on this is to go to the various websites for these translations, and they will list out the biblical scholars that worked on them. And you will see dozens of names. You'll see people with PhDs in Old Testament and New Testament, especially, of course, but you're going to probably have some in theology and related fields. And these are people who've given their lives to studying and teaching, the Bible. And like you just said, you focus on Old Testament. Typically, that's where the translators are too. They're focusing on either Old Testament or New Testament. It's pretty rare that you'd have somebody with the skills necessary to translate both Hebrew and Greek, really well. I think there are a lot of people who have, middling ability at least in both, but typically people, favor one or the other. And these men and women have to sit down for all the hours that it takes to join a committee to work through the foundational documents that establish the theory that they'll be using. Where are we trying to aim at on the spectrum of formal to functional? Why are what will be the elements of our philosophy? The King James translators had 14 points that they had to hew to. Some of those are actually kind of political, like church politics back in their day, and those are not, those are relevant in our day too. We've had major fights over gender language that I've tried to wade into just a little bit in my video on the NIV. And Poitras has written on that. Carson has written on that. A lot of people have written on that. Mark Strauss has written on that. You got to be aware of these things. And the editors, the leaders have to sit down with everybody and talk it through. And then they all got to do the work and got to have it checked back and forth, and then they got to go back and forth with not just the editors who have their PhDs, but the I almost said lower level editors. That doesn't sound quite right, but the folks whose focus is English. There are English stylists that are involved in a lot of these translations. There are copy editors that have to come along, and there's compositors. So the process, I have not been personally involved in one of the major Bible translations out there, but I did help with the Lexham English Septuagint. And I was one of basically the glorified copy editors. I was in a mid-tier between the major translator and the folks who were focusing only on English. And I and a couple other guys were being presented by others with anything that just didn't look quite right. And then we would go back to the Greek because we're translating the Septuagint into English, and we would make a judgment call. I found that to be really, really enjoyable, and I would love to be asked to be on a Bible translation committee one of these years. And if you're out there, committees, I'm here. Just call me. It'd be fun to do that kind of work. Does that answer your question enough? I could probably go into more detail, but might take a while.
Well, we'll get into it. So, to sum up, I mean, so I asked, like, how does the translation start? So, I mean, is it as simple as just one person saying, "Hey, I've got money. We're gonna hire some
Good.
scholars"?
You're a good interviewer who deftly reminded me I didn't answer the question that you actually asked, so I'm sorry about that. How does it
No, totally
start?
fine.
Well, the ones I'm familiar with, the NIV. Here's how it started. Here in Seattle, Washington. So I'm in Bellingham right now, about an hour and a half north, 2 hours of Seattle. And I'm going to be there tomorrow in Seattle. There was a businessman who was trying to witness the gospel back in the 50s to another businessman in a hotel in Portland. And this guy was from Seattle, and he read the King James Version to this, non-Christian businessman, and the guy just laughed out loud. He said, "Who in the world talks like that?" So this man came back to his pastor, Peter DeYoung, I believe was the pastor's name in Seattle, and said, when are we going to get a Bible translation that's in our English, basically? And that is what ended up launching the New International Version. I forget some of the details, to be honest, but he ended up reaching out to, I think he was in the Christian Reformed Church, one of the Dutch Reformed denominations. You can tell by that last name, De Jong, and this is a major Dutch Calvinist area. But they ended up working with other denominations and putting together a multi-denominational committee that did the New International Version. Or the ESV, begun by Crossway. They picked up the copyright from the RSV, paid the National Council of Churches for this, and they wanted to have a more formal, and I would say that in two senses, more literal, but also more literarily formal translation, and one that was done with a somewhat tighter denomination, list of denominational groupings involved, but still a multi-denominational committee. That's how the ESV got started. I'm trying to think of the NASB. I'm a little less clear on it, but it is also, it's in the line of the King James. It's a revision of a revision of the King James, but it's also gone off in its kind of its own direction. The Lockman Foundation, which is, just like Good News Publishers, which is responsible for the ESV. It's a nonprofit, so that's another answer to the question. What role does money play in these translations? I do not know actually how the Lockman Foundation first got involved in doing the NASB, but typically it's institutions who have the power to make this sort of thing happen, and the resources. I'm trying to think. The CSB, well, that would be the Southern Baptist Convention, although they work with a multi-denominational group. The New Living Translation grew out of one man's work ultimately, the Living Bible, but it sold so well that they started a publisher, Tyndale House Publishers, if I recall correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong. In the comments, you guys can do that. And over time, they realized we really have something here. Let's put more resources into it. And so they got scholars to work on the different books, including a friend of mine, Dale Brueggemann, who used to work here with me at Faith Life, right up above where I'm sitting right now here. He worked on the book of Numbers or Leviticus, I think. Those are, the Lord can use various means to get these things started. But typically, we're talking about institutions and not individuals.
Interesting, very fascinating. That makes a lot of sense because you gotta know the people, you gotta get the people to work together. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so off the cuff question, what about modern revisions? So like I know NIV had their one translation, but then I guess 23, 30 years down the line, they're like, hey, we need to update it. Do you know how that usually happens?
Yes, I think that every major modern evangelical English Bible translation lives, I would say, fairly happily in the shadow of the King James Version. And it's that monolith, that one ring that's been ruling them all for centuries, that helps define the task of Bible translation in so many ways. And that's true both of the things that we want to reproduce from the King James, famous phrases and the basic balance of, formal versus functional translations within it. But also, it's modern translations all live with the at least implicit understanding that translations can, over time, become too archaic. Overall, the King James is not totally archaic. You can understand a lot of it, even as a modern reader. But a major burden of my work is to show that it's no longer sufficiently intelligible to be used as our main Bible translation in a church or parachurch ministry. So everybody who does work on evangelical English Bible translations is well aware of this, and so the only way to stop that from happening to their own translation is to bake some kind of revision plan into it, even if it is over the decades, as it has proven to be with the NIV. Not quite decades with the ESV, they had more frequent revisions. There are times when there are major adjustments in language. I do think that one of the things driving, well, I know this, you can read what Moo has very carefully written in explanations for the need for the NIV 2011. So that would be what, like 17 years, 27 years. Why can't I think straight? Yeah, 27. After the 1984 NIV came out, they're putting out this, new edition. Why can I not think how many years it is? How much is 2011 minus 1984? I'm just going to do the math. 27, yes, okay.
27.
27 years, they put out another edition, and one of the reasons they did that was that, in their professional judgment, having used corpus linguistics, which means looking at tons and tons and tons and tons of actual written and, I think in this case, spoken English, they determined that when you say he in certain contexts and man in certain contexts, where the inspired authors intended, to include men and women, that a lot of contemporary English speakers are hearing a very specific male reference. And so that was one of their, reasons for making an update. I think that the ESV, I gather, just trying to do due diligence. I can't speak for them. I'm not an official spokesperson for Good News Publishers or Crossway, but they were trying to do due diligence and fixing up little things that, had come to their attention since the ESV had come out. I don't think there were major, moves in language or in scholarship that moved them to make this revision. The CSB, I think, was trying to escape a little bit some of the oddities of the HCSB. So there are various reasons. It's all over the map, really, for why various institutions want to, do a revision. I think always, ultimately, they are just trying to get God's word out to people in a way that's as faithful as they know how to do it at that spot on the, formal to functional spectrum that we talked about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so as far as choosing, you talked a little bit about it, but I mean, I've heard something that, some translations don't even have some of the like the translators in the translation committee aren't even they don't even have PhDs in a specific language. I mean, have you heard anything about that? Like, what would you say is the background of most or even all of most translators?
Yeah, the great majority of translators that I've seen, every time I've checked these long lists of, biblical scholars who've worked on these translations, they almost all have PhDs. They don't all. The exceptions, I do think, tend to prove the rule. I'm going to give an example. I don't know that he was involved in. I think he was involved in the Lexham English Septuagint, as I recall. I don't remember for sure. It's my friend Mike Aubrey. Mike told me once in a sort of wry, self deprecatory humor, he says, I'm overeducated and undercredentialed. At the time, I think, and this may still be the case, he has an MA, I think, in I don't know what biblical studies is somehow. I want to say he went to Moody Bible Institute and then got an MA somewhere, but the guy is a recognized authority. And I was just reading a book on linguistics and New Testament Greek that he was a major contributor to. His chapter was excellent, very helpful. He obviously knows what's going on. He's done tons of reading in linguistics. He's way ahead of me on those things. I like to bounce ideas off of him and just check with him on things. I paid for coffee with him when I put out my book Authorized because I just wanted to check in on a couple linguistic ideas with him. And thankfully he gave a thumbs up, and I was very appreciative of that. He's, again, the exception that proves the rule. The quality of his work just speaks for itself. And there are such people on translation committees. Those who don't have PhDs would either be like that or they would be English stylists. There are people whose job it is not to know what the Hebrew and Greek means, but to have an ear for how this reads for English speakers. And that's appropriate and necessary too. And typically they would not have PhDs in that case. But pretty much a PhD is expected in the West, the modern, wealthy, educated West. You need to have a PhD if you're going to work actually translating the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into English.
Yeah, I would have thought that would be assumed. Although that's cool that someone like Mike Aubrey. I mean, I've heard the name. I don't know a lot about him, but yeah, he's definitely a well-known guy. So that's interesting that he would be so well-known, even though he doesn't have the specific, PhD in it. Okay, so uh, I would assume that when you talked about it, most experts are going to be a specific field, Old Testament or New Testament. Uh, how would you say, like, what is the minimal work that someone's going to do on translation? And what I mean by that is, like, if I write my dissertation on one specific verse in the Old Testament, is someone going to hire me for that specific verse? Or, I mean, is anyone going to actually, like, ask me for advice or whatever for one specific verse? Or is it usually just sections? Is it like, 2 or 3 chapters, or do you have one guy writing a whole or translating a whole book? What are your thoughts on that?
Um, I want to be careful not to speak beyond my knowledge and experience. I myself may be overeducated and undercredentialed in this area, overeducated and underexperienced because I have not worked on these committees. But when I've checked and when I have access to who's done what, it does seem to me that it's larger sections. It's certainly much larger than a verse. And of course, if you do your PhD, you do your dissertation on one particular verse in the Old Testament, the only way that you're going to have those skills and also therefore be persuasive with other people in the field is if you do have broader knowledge than just that. You have to have learned biblical Hebrew. And you have to be appealing to cognate languages. You have to be appealing to parallel passages. You have to understand literary genre. You're not going to be so narrowly focused on that verse that you're no earthly good with anything else. You'll be able to translate other things in the Hebrew Bible, and you will have taken courses along that line, coursework on Hebrew Bible and Old Testament theology, etc. So I would presume that if you're an expert on that particular verse, probably you've got some insight into that author or that genre or that period of Israel's history or that book of the Bible. or that section of the Old Testament. And that's what's going to get your name noticed and going to get Doug Moo, calling you, or Vern Poythress, whoever is in charge, editorial Tom Schreiner, and saying, hey, could you help us with, translating this particular section or book? But yeah, I presume it would end up being, from what I've seen, would end up being something like typically an entire book of the Bible, or if they're small, maybe all the minor prophets, something like that.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, it actually makes a lot of sense now that I think about it. Okay, so maybe not specific sections, but scholars, they do not have all the time in the world to read every single
Right.
dissertation that's written on something crazy like Genesis or Revelation, where there's probably a billion dissertations out there. Uh, I mean, would you what would you say that like what actually happens in these scenarios? Because you have super complicated books, and you can't be an expert on every single verse. So what that's going to mean is that if someone's writing or translating one specific chapter, you're going to end up having some people that aren't experts on specific chapters. Maybe they might have a really good knowledge of it, but not expert level. um, like, what do you think about that? Do you think that there's a possibility that some of these translations don't have the
Don't reflect the latest
expertise to
scholarship.
be translating it?
Yeah, well, absolutely. There's nobody out there who can keep up with all of the writing of biblical studies. They're going to miss something. And who gave us this situation? I always say that. God gave us a situation in which fallen, finite people are going to translate the Bible for us. And what a great situation to have, right? Where, one of my favorite Bible translators, he's written a great book. It was so helpful to me. I got it when I had a terrible flu. I bought it on Kindle, and I could not stop reading it, even though I was terribly ill. His name is Dave Brunn. The book is One Bible, Many Versions. And he endorsed my book, and I was really, really thrilled about that because I have such high respect for him. He translated for the Lemugai people of Papua New Guinea. How much scholarship was he able to bring to bear on his work for them? As much as he had, which was quite good. He's a really smart guy. But is he an expert in all the latest dissertations on whatever topic? No, there's just no way. And back in those days, whenever that was, I want to say in the 90s, they would have had fewer in the way of electronic resources than we do now. And that's just got to be okay. And one of the reasons that is okay is that actually translating the Bible isn't that hard when we're talking about these very narrow niche things, like the kind of thing that someone would write a whole dissertation on, or like cognate language type stuff. You just have to remember, I find this to be so hard for a lot of people to remember. A lot of the Bible is not directly doctrinal in that one spot. A lot of it is quotidian, mundane. And if you look at that passage, Job 17:6, I mentioned earlier, I did a video on it because it's the one place where I've, argued that, yes, I think the King James translators did hear exactly what they said they probably would do, which is commit an error. I think that they missed and didn't have access to the cognate languages there, and so they used the word tabret or tambourine when they should have used a word like spit. A very, very minor thing. That changes zero doctrine. It probably doesn't change even some liturgical reading in any church somewhere, right? That's the kind of thing that added scholarship will often do for you. Now, is that Bible word important enough that someone ought to put the hours into it to learn cognate languages so they can say spit instead of tambourine? Yes, it's worth it. Someone's got to do that, and I'm glad that they've done it. But was the church for 300 years in the English-speaking world, were they misled because now they believe in the doctrine of tambourines rather than the doctrine of spitting? No. God has given us this situation, and the King James translators talk about this. I appeal to them all the time because their preface, written by Miles Smith, one of the translators, is so chock full of wisdom that applies absolutely today. And they think just like contemporary biblical scholars do. In that preface, they acknowledge, they said, there are some obscure Hebrew words of rocks and birds and stuff that we get the distinct feeling, this is the way they talk, it's so funny. We get the distinct feeling that even the Jews don't know what these words mean, and they're just writing something down to write something down. That's what the King James translators said. And who gave us that situation? God did, with these occasional, very obscure things. So most translating is not that hard. And therefore, most translations at most places don't differ very much at all, even if you go beyond evangelical translations into Catholic or mainline or Eastern Orthodox, or even sectarian ones like the Jehovah's Witnesses, New World Translation. Most of the time, they say exactly the same thing with mildly different wording. Where scholarship really comes into play is at some passages that are more obscure and just a few places that get fought over. Ephesians 5, Genesis 3:16. Right now it's gender stuff and sexuality stuff. That does require some added scholarly attention. And the right people, in my experience, are getting asked to weigh in on those things. People are putting the time in. But I don't want people to worry when they hear, oh no, how is it even possible for everyone to keep abreast, all these translators keep abreast of all the developments in biblical scholarship? Well, it's not possible. They have to do their dead level best and leave the rest to the Lord.
Hmm. Yeah, really well said. I appreciate that. Okay, so when we're talking about expertise, I did an interview, or not an interview, but a review the other day of a a specific speaker that apparently grew up Jewish, is a native born Hebrew speaker, and I was talking with my scholar friend, and the scholar friend's like, yeah, that his Hebrew, he's wrong about that. Okay, he's wrong, and it's like, that's weird. Like, native born Hebrew speaker wrong about Hebrew. How does that make any sense? And so I'm curious, when we're talking about qualifications for doing a translation, why exactly, or how can we even say that someone who's a native born speaker wouldn't be able to do a translation? Like, why in the world we would need like a PhD to do a translation?
Well, there are no native born speakers of the particular versions of Greek and Hebrew that are used in the Bible. Koine Greek, as a dialect, as it were, of Greek, died out a long time ago. Modern Greek is not the same. The Greek New Testament has had to be translated actually more than once. My understanding is starting back in the 19th century, this started to be done. It probably was needed a long time before that. Because languages change over time, right? Modern Greek, the New Testament was translated from Koine Greek, ancient Greek, into modern Greek, going back into the 19th century at least. Modern Hebrew, I've read actually several books about the revivification of Hebrew as a spoken language. I just think that is the most fascinating, amazing thing possible. That you teach a bunch of adults a dead language. It was liturgically, religiously kept alive, but kind of barely, I would say. What's the word for computer? How do you say, hey, I got to take my car to the shop next week in Hebrew? All that stuff had to be invented by linguists and sort of agreed upon by the culture. And actually, it was children in Israel, after 1948, who were especially instrumental in making Hebrew again a spoken language. I just think that is so amazing. God's blessing on the Jewish nation, and my wife is actually ethnically Jewish on her mother's side, is incredible, and that's one of his blessings, I think. But modern Hebrew is not the same as biblical Hebrew, and it's difficult for me to say exactly how much can a typical modern Hebrew speaker get out of biblical Hebrew. I don't have a handle on that. I've been trying to get a better handle on that, but I can just say they're not the same. And so that is why if somebody grew up speaking Hebrew, either that means he was speaking modern Hebrew and it is not the same as biblical, or that means that he went to the synagogue and learned, as we've seen on TV, young folks have to, in Jewish, various Jewish, I almost want to say denominations, they have their own sects, people who view their Judaism differently. Those who are more dedicated to it may learn a fair bit of biblical Hebrew. But it's very possible in that case, here I'm kind of stepping out on a limb, that they're so influenced by the tradition that's developed over time that somebody coming at it from a, Protestant perspective would see differently. There I'm really speculating. I don't know. I'd have to know more about the story to render a judgment.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I like that viewpoint on that. Okay, so um, we're talking about someone that has not learned Hebrew formally or even Greek. What I get this all the time, so and so, he's an expert. He didn't get an education. He didn't go to college, but he knows Greek and Hebrew. You just gotta trust him. Um, like, what is so special about getting a formal education in a language like Greek and Hebrew?
So I put a lot of time into this because I had to I had to justify all the time I spent getting this formal education. I had to justify it to myself. I had to justify it to the imagined critics in my mind, including from my King James only upbringing, people who would have seen all that education as, at best dangerous, because there's a lot of mocking of education in that particular world. Although in my particular church and my mentors there, I don't think they talked that way. But I've thought, I go back to B.B. Warfield in his classic essay, The Religious Life of Theological Students, where he says, some people say you should spend 10 hours on your knees instead of 10 hours studying. And he's like, why not 10 hours of studying on your knees? If the intellectual life and the religious life are that opposed, then we shouldn't be doing this at all. And there are traditions. The Amish are well known for this, and some, I think, Brethren denominations or Mennonite, where they don't want their pastors to be educated. They're chosen by lot. And I think in general we've seen the problems with that. Protestant denominations, in my experience, tend to sort of seesaw a little bit. There are problems caused by education, and there are problems that are caused by lack of education. We live in a fallen world, and everybody's fallen and finite, and knowledge puffs up. But ignorance does that pretty well too, pretty frequently. And so what I tend to say is, people will, on my YouTube channel, will frequently be making comments, skeptical of those who are educated. And I say, it is true. Having a PhD does not make you right about the Bible. Well, but neither does not having a PhD. So how can I expect people to trust me? Why should I? And I've always just thought, the only thing I can do is lovingly use my gifts and my training, such as they are, for the benefit of other people. And if they see that benefit and they bite into that food that I'm serving them in Bible teaching, and they say, yum, I want more of this, thank you, then that's the only validation and means of building trust I can give. That's where we're stuck, and unless we had a pope who could tell us this teacher is right and that teacher is wrong. And, Protestants, we say we don't, and I don't believe we do. And until Jesus at the final judgment validates some people's interpretations and says that other people were like the Pharisees, and he has to say to them, have you not read? That judgment day is not coming until the end. So we have to fall on God's mercy, read our Bibles on our own, like all of our evangelical pastors told us to do, and pray for the Lord to guide us and give us wisdom.
Appreciate that. Okay, so you kind of talked about, some translations, there could be a little bias in there. Can you talk about ways that these translations, the committees are set up to avoid bias?
I went to a school that was born out of the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Bob Jones University was formed as Bob Jones College in 1927 in College Point, Florida, I believe. And Dr. Bob Jones Sr. was a barnstorming evangelist traveling around the country giving the gospel. And that fundamentalist modernist controversy, out of which was born, modern evangelicalism as well, was a recognition that that people who believe in the gospel can't maintain fellowship and certainly, institutional cohesion with those who are preaching a different gospel or denying the gospel or denying the Bible. And this is terrible. I have forgotten the question that you just asked. Can you say it one more time?
The question was, how do translation committees, or just in general or whatever,
there we go,
how do they prevent bias from affecting the translations?
So when the conservative Bible-believing, gospel-preaching Presbyterians and the conservative Bible-believing, gospel-preaching Methodists and Baptists pulled out of liberalizing or, fully liberal denominations, and we're not just talking politically liberal, we're talking they're denying the virgin birth, they're denying the inspiration of Scripture, denying fundamental core Christian doctrines. They, instead of at that time typically forming their own new denominational institutions, although that did happen too, like Westminster is a Presbyterian school formed out of the fundamentalist modernist controversy. A fair number of them made multi-denominational conservative, at that time, fundamentalist institutions, and that's the way Bob Jones was. And although Bob Jones ended up being more Baptist over time, because I think the conservative Presbyterians and Methodists ended up forming their own schools anyway, over time, still that multi-denominational character was there. And I'm grateful for that. I think that it saved us from some problems. Now, every institution has its problems. Bob Jones certainly did. And there are sinners there still, I hear. Even after I left, there are sinners still there. But I think that the basic insight that you want to spread out the responsibility to multiple denominations so that you have some checks and balances. I think that's righteous and wise. I think it's a way of honoring the way the way Christ rules his church. There's just no denying, to my mind, that there are people who baptize babies and yet are true Christians, right? And they love the Lord, and they know some things I don't know and have strengths that I don't have. And hopefully me and my Credo Baptist tradition, I have some strengths and insights that I can contribute as well. It just doesn't seem that the Lord has given all of the, doctrinal and sanctificational fidelity to one group of Christians, and everybody else is, somewhere below the peak of the mountain. I believe that, I'm not a total relativist either. I think some people really are wrong about stuff, right? And that's why I'm in my tradition. But I recognize the goodness of God in giving gifts to, people in other traditions. So I like the idea that Presbyterians and Baptists and Evangelical Methodists, work together. Calvinists and Arminians, cessationists and continuationists, what have you, congregational polity versus whatever, bring them together to work on this. And just those couple times when the Anglican evangelical will say to the Baptist evangelical, what if you said it a little differently so that it doesn't seem to be favoring your party? I just think that's a valuable thing because I know the Bible is not the possession of my tradition. It rules over mine and all other traditions.
So basically, the people, I guess, the organizations hiring to do translations, choosing people with different beliefs so that when they come together, they can, I guess, counter each other's bias, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I still typically want to see these being Bible-believing, gospel-preaching Christians. I'm an evangelical. I don't deny that the grace of God exists outside of evangelicalism. I believe that it is out there. But I'm a firm, Reformation era Protestant. And I like my translations, the ones I focused on, all come from Protestants, but of various sorts. And I just named some of those sorts. And I'm glad for that. I think there needs to be a practical limit. So I go to the Evangelical Theological Society annual meeting, and I don't tend to go to the SBL meeting, which always happens right after it. Not because there's no value at SBL, there is. One big reason is that I have 3 young children and I don't want to leave my wife home alone for a week. But the reason I choose ETS over SBL is at least it's a practical limit. I'm going to go hear papers by people who believe in inerrancy and Trinitarianism. That means I'm not going to hear something wild and crazy that's just going to waste my time, which can happen at SBL alongside a lot of other, plenty great papers. So I tend to view that as a wise and practical limit. Can you subscribe to an evangelical, Protestant doctrinal statement? Then that would be a minimum for somebody, a qualification for them working on an evangelical Bible translation.
Okay, so last question. What happens when you have something like a complementarian or egalitarian or a Calvinist Arminian? They disagree on what a specific translation should be in a verse. What happens there?
I first want to admit I don't know. I don't know if that has happened. I know that there are complementarians who work at the NIV. Mark Strauss has said that he's a complementarian. And D.A. Carson, who has defended the, quote unquote gender neutral, I would call it gender accurate, like I think Carson does, language of the NIV 2011. I actually defend it too, with some real regret at stepping away from fellow conservatives. I am a complementarian, and I think it's very important. But if I were put on a committee with an egalitarian, I would take that as God's call to me, and I would expect my brother or sister in Christ, who's an egalitarian, to do the same, to work with that person or whatever group that we're in to try to achieve whatever compromise that we can. The only way I would be pulling out of that as if I had to, I was compelled to, whatever my view is, Calvinism, Arminianism, egalitarianism, complementarianism, if for some reason I just could no longer trust in the goodwill of that other person, and I just felt that they were, um, with both professional, this would be both a professional problem and a personal theological, sanctification problem. If they were pushing an agenda, then I can imagine that just not working. But most of the people that I can imagine being put on a committee to do that kind of work have been picked because they've shown some level of grace, ability to work with others. So I can think of, I won't name names, but I can think of an egalitarian right now that I think, I would like to work on a Bible translation with this individual. Happens to be a ordained woman. She's overall, conservative, believes the same gospel I do. I think we could have very fruitful conversations that we would both learn from. I'm not aware that that's happening. I just don't know. I wouldn't be happening at the ESV because that is put out by a complementarian group. It probably is happening a little at the NIV. But here's the great thing about translating. There almost always is, I'm going to say there always is, a straightforward, middle-of-the-road way to say things that just repeats what, Paul or Jesus or Jude or Moses or whatever says. It isn't really always that complicated. The number of places where it would really come to a knockdown, drag-out fight, I just don't think they're very many.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, this has been such great talking to you. Is there any places? I mean, you have your book you mentioned earlier that'll be linked in the description. You have your YouTube channel link in the description. You have a website that you want to point people to?
I have a blog by faithweunderstand.com. That's probably more personal stuff typically nowadays. Denominational stuff for my own denomination, often book reviews. I don't post to it much. Really, YouTube is where I'm at most of the time. I would encourage people to check out the Word by Word blog that I'm a senior editor for. We're putting a lot of resources into revamping this. Over the years, I used to read the Logos blog, but I would get a little tired of all the sales stuff that would come through. And we are really changing that. We actually already have, and we're really excited in 2023 to be able to get some really great writers. And I'm hopeful that some of my own stuff will be up on that blog, and that your viewers might enjoy reading some of the articles at Word by Word.
Awesome. You've got a great perspective and a great way to talk to people and really show them love. And I really appreciate with your work and this interview today. So this has been great. I hope you have a great rest of your night, Dr. Ward.
Thank you so much.